Yes, sir.
Well, that was interesting. I didn't even want to stop it.
Okay.
I was there last night as well, and I want to thank you as well as last night for sticking to the Tanakh, and the discussion here is about how God is relating to us as opposed to how we formulate God or how we choose to make God.
Agreed.
And that was both nights, and I appreciate that.
Good.
One of the things that I thought was interesting about last night that I haven't heard you address was how serious the objection was to the notion of a Jew becoming Messianic because, and I want to get this exactly right, because Rabbi Kravitz said that if you believe in a Messiah who's physical, that's a form of idolatry.
If you believe in the divine Messiah.
Yeah.
Right, it's not traditional Jews believe in a physical Messiah, but they don't believe in the divine Messiah.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, and for those that really want to get interested in this, and I would not dare get into this, otherwise I'd bore a lot of you, but I spent about 70,000 words in Volume 2 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus dealing with this very issue. So for those that want to dig more and go into the sources, you can do that. Doesn't it say in Numbers 23:19 that God is not a man that he should lie? Doesn't it say in 1 Samuel 15 that God is not a man? Therefore, if you say that Jesus is God, aren't you therefore making a man into God or God into a man, which is the worst form of idolatry? Doesn't it say in Deuteronomy 4, when God spoke from Sinai, that you didn't see any form, and you shouldn't worship the form of a man or an animal or anything? That's idolatry. So first thing, if I was worshiping a man as God, and if I was worshiping the physical form as the form of God, that would in fact be idolatry. My only question on this is not even what does the New Testament say, but what does the Tanakh say? What do the Hebrew Scriptures say? So as I examine the Hebrew Scriptures, here's what I see. I see that God is complex in his unity, as I mentioned earlier. That's one thing. I see in Genesis 18, and if you haven't studied it carefully, go home and read it, okay? Genesis 18, Yahweh appears in physical form with two others to Abraham after his circumcision. According to traditional Judaism, it was 3 angels that came to visit him after he was circumcised to check on his condition. The text would indicate it's been some time since he was circumcised because he actually goes running in the text, which is not the normal thing you do after circumcision. But it's clear that Yahweh appears physically, if you just read the text, okay? It's clear that he talks to Abraham and Sarah. You just read the text in an unbiased way. This is one of these crystal clear things. And then it says at the end of the chapter that Yahweh stays and dialogues with Abraham, okay? And that the other two, then it says, and 2 men who were angels, it turns out, come to Sodom. So 3 men come to Abraham, Yahweh and 2 angels. If you just read the text, Yahweh stays and talks to Abraham, and the other 2 go on in the 19th chapter. Any plain reading of the text, I defy anyone to read the text plainly and come to any other conclusion. Just on a simple plain reading of the text. What's the point? Does God remain God in heaven? Of course. Does he remain enthroned and invisible? Of course. Doesn't it say in Exodus, the 33rd chapter, that no one can see him and live? Yes. It also says in John, in the New Testament, John 1:18, no man has seen God. Well, hang on. You're saying Jesus is God, but then you're saying no one has seen God? I don't get it. Paul writes in 1 Timothy 6 about God that he dwells in unapproachable light and no one can see him. No one's ever seen him. So the New Testament also affirms that directly, that no one can see God. And yet, think of this, Yahweh appears in physical form in Genesis 18. Exodus 24, shortly after the revelation at Sinai, this is still on Mount Sinai. What does it say in Exodus 24? That Moses, Aaron, the elders, they saw the God of Israel. Isaiah 6, Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up, and his throne fills, the train of his robe fills the temple, etc. So you have these different examples of people actually seeing God or having some encounter with God, and yet no one has seen God. How? How do we explain that? Then we also have in Psalm 45, which is a royal psalm, it says there, in praise of the king, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. You just read that just by itself, that it's talking about God. Your throne, O Elohim, is forever and ever. It's talking to the king. Then the next verse says that God, even your God, has anointed you. how can he be called God, and yet God anoints him? Isaiah, the 9th chapter, verse 5 in Hebrew, verse 6 in Christian English translations, says that this son who will be born, this Messianic king, will be called Pele Yoetz El Gibor Aviad Sar Shalom, and El Gibor is mighty God. Now what's interesting is that Ibn Ezra says that El Gibor is actually a descriptive title of the earthly king. That means mighty God. The Talmud even makes reference to that. So how can an earthly king be called Elohim or be called El Gibor? How can it be called divine? It doesn't work. Unless they are prophecies of God making himself known in flesh and blood. You say, well, I don't get it. How can he be God in heaven and on the earth at the same time? It doesn't make sense. And then what about it talks about his ruach, his spirit being on the prophets? That's what Christians call the Trinity. In other words, that God is triune in his nature. As I said, his unity is complex. We worship one God, not three. And that his Son comes down, walks among us, and that the only way to read Tanakh that makes sense to me is whenever God revealed himself to man, it was his Son making himself known. He's the one that if you read the Targums, the Aramaic paraphrases and translations of the Tanakh, instead of talking about the Lord spoke, it'll say the memra of the Lord spoke. The word of the Lord spoke. Instead of saying the Lord touched, it would say the memra of the Lord touched. Instead of Jacob saying, I will worship, or the Lord will be my God in Genesis 28, it says the memra of the Lord will be my God. This is kind of a literary device to speak of this intermediary way of God making himself known. The mystics talked about the 10 sphirot, these different emanations, if you want to use a Gnostic word for it, of God's character and nature, and how the infinite eternal God, transcendent God, touches man. The rabbi spoke of the Shekhinah, the presence of God on the earth. One rabbi once said to me, so you kind of believe that Jesus is a walking Shekhinah? I said, that says it well. Good example. That works. So first thing, we worship the one unseen eternal God who revealed himself through his Son in flesh and blood. We don't worship the flesh and blood. We don't worship a form. No one has ever seen God, but he makes himself known most fully to us through Yeshua. And I could only take Tanakh, and based on Tanakh, worship a God who is eternal, invisible, transcendent, and yet at times makes himself known in flesh and blood on the earth and reveals himself to people and speaks in an active first-hand way while remaining God in heaven. Through later reflection, through the writings of the New Testament, we call that God's triunity, or a complex unity. So there's nothing idolatrous about it. I don't worship a man. I've never worshipped a man. I worship the one eternal, unseen God who made himself known through Yeshua. Rightly understood, there's nothing idolatrous about it. And in fact, it makes sense out of a lot of passages in the Hebrew Bible. For those that, it's a very deep, complex subject, the nature of God is. For those that want to study it more, we'll get ample references in Volume 2 of Jewish Objections. Yes, sir. The mic is open.